How are we doing today? I hope you can hear me. Drop me a hello in the comments if you can hear me. I'm just going to give it a minute to go live. I think we're good. Do say hello in the comments if you can hear me and see me. So this week I've been talking, this week and last week I've been talking a little bit about genes and Alzheimer's, because that is really misunderstood, and I really want to clear this up a little bit for you guys, and just give you a little bit of information as to what this all really means for you, what those genes mean, and why we shouldn't be afraid of them. All right, I think this is my biggest mission, is for us not to be afraid of our genes, because they don't dictate our fate. All right, they do not seal our fate. So last week I talked a little bit about genes and kind of how they work to kind of influence different vitamins, for example, and how we can tailor our nutrition and our lifestyle to cater for our genes to get the outcomes that we want. So if you haven't watched that, then head back and find the video from last week. But this week I want to talk a little bit more specifically about the APOE gene. And I talked about it briefly last week, but this is the gene that it's often called the Alzheimer's gene. All right, and this kind of irks me, which is why I do these, right? It's labeled the Alzheimer's gene. There's lots of different genes that will impact risk for Alzheimer's, but the APOE gene has the strongest correlation, so the strongest risk correlation. So it gets labeled the Alzheimer's gene, and I think that's what sort of stirs up a lot of this misconception, is that it gets labeled this, so people think if I have this particular gene then I'm going to get Alzheimer's. All right, and it is not at all like that. That is not how this gene works. So there's two different sorts of genes, and there's deterministic genes and risk genes. Deterministic genes are ones that if you get this gene, you will get this disease, no doubt about it, all right? And that is the case for things like Huntington's and a couple of other specific conditions. But when it comes to Alzheimer's, those genes are present. They're in about 1% of cases or less. So they're very, very rare, and you would know if you were part of this, because it's part of these very rare, very aggressive family groups. So you would likely know very clearly if you had these deterministic genes. So what most of us are talking about are the risk genes, right? They're the ones that just impact our risk, increase it maybe, or perhaps we've got the same risk as the general population. And as I say, there's lots of these different genes, and APOE is just one of them, okay? And I do want to talk about this today, and next week or in a few days' time, I will talk about some of the other genes that impact our risk as well, but I want to clear up this APOE thing to start with. So first of all, what is APOE and what is the APOE gene? Well, APOE is short for apolipoprotein E. There's apolipoprotein A, B, etc. And this is apolipoprotein E. And what this actually is, as the name kind of suggests, lipo means fat and protein is protein. So it's basically a carrier for fat in the body. So it carries and transports fat around the body. And this APOE gene kind of directs some of that, right? So it kind of directs how well this protein, or the different ways in which this protein works in the body. So we all have this protein. We all have APOE inside our body. And the gene essentially just directs that in different ways in different people. So in the body, so outside of the brain and the rest of the body, APOE essentially is that carrier of cholesterol and protein. Cholesterol and fats. Inside the brain, though, APOE is actually not just involved in that fat transport, which is really important because our brain needs fats and the right sorts of fats, but it is also involved in clearing amyloid from the brain. And if you're familiar with Alzheimer's, amyloid is another protein, which is what makes up those plaques, right? Those plaques that occur in the brain. You'll see them on brain scans of Alzheimer's patients. And it is those plaques which kind of, for want of a better word, clog up the brain, right? They kind of affect the way that the brain functions because they're these big clogs of protein. So what APOE in the brain does is it can clear some of those, right? So that amyloid buildup is kind of normal, but when it gets excessive, is when we get a problem. So this APOE clears this out, right? It has this action of helping to clear out the amyloid. So I hope you can start to see with its role in fats and with its role in amyloid, how it might change our risk for Alzheimer's. And that's exactly what happens, right? The way that this protein works in the body in different ways will either increase or decrease your risk of Alzheimer's. And when it comes to the gene and kind of understanding what you have and what your variants are, there's 3 different variants of the APOE gene, right? There's an E2, an E3, and an E4. And like any genes, we get 2 copies. We get one from our mother and one from our father. So what that means with these 3 different variants is there's lots of ways that they can combine. So you could have an E2 from your mum and an E2 from your dad, or an E2 from your mum and an E4 from your dad, or an E3 from both of them, right? So you can see there's lots of these different combinations of the E2, the E3, and the E4. And this is what changes or directs the way that this works in our body. So if you have one of the APOE2 genes, 1 or 2 copies, this is the least common, right? This is the least usual, and it actually can be slightly protective. So it can slightly protect your brain from Alzheimer's, slightly better at clearing that amyloid and better at delivering the right sorts of fats into your brain. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you are protected from Alzheimer's just because you have that E2 gene, all right? That's really important to know. Now, the E3 is the most common, and this is most people will have either 2 3s, so a 3 from mum and 3 from dad, or a 3 from one parent combined with one of the other ones. It's considered kind of neutral, right? It's kind of considered normal, neutral, no increased or decreased risk of Alzheimer's. It just is the kind of baseline, right? APOE4 is the one that directs things in a way that is a little bit more risky for building up amyloid and for resulting in Alzheimer's. But what this also does, because it involves fat and cholesterol, is it also increases your risk of heart disease, right? So coronary artery disease, atherosclerosis, like hardening of the arteries. But what really irks me is we don't call this gene the heart disease gene, right? It gets labeled the Alzheimer's gene when it actually increases your risk of both of these conditions. And we don't immediately think of heart disease as a genetic condition, as in like, oh my gosh, I've got a gene that's going to tell me if I'm going to get heart disease, because that's not how it works. And yet we seem to have this misconception about Alzheimer's that that's suddenly how it works. And that is not the case, right? So APOE4 just increases our risk of both of those things. And the reason that it does that is because of what it does in the body. But it is so, so important to remember that this E4, if you have 1 or 2 copies of APOE4 gene, it's just one of many risk factors, right? Lots of different risk factors will combine to give you your risk of dementia and Alzheimer's, just like many risk factors will combine to give you your risk of heart disease. So just because you have one of these does not mean that you're going to get a heart disease and does not mean that you're going to get Alzheimer's or dementia, all right? It just means that, you know, people with that gene are slightly more likely to under the right circumstances, or should I say under the wrong circumstances, essentially. So it just changes our risk, all right? And I've got a little image which I'm going to show you. I can't share it here, but I'm going to put it in the comments to show you the different percentages and what we mean by that. So essentially, it varies by populations and different sort of ethnicities around the world, but somewhere around 10 to 25% of the general population will have the E4, 1 or 2 copies of the E4 gene. But when we look at Alzheimer's patients, we have between 40 and 65% of Alzheimer's patients that have that E4 gene. So what that means is that more people with Alzheimer's have that E4 gene than the general population, and that's what indicates that it increases our risk, all right? Because it's more common in people with Alzheimer's because of the way that it functions. But ultimately, whether you have the 4 or the 2 or the 3, it does not seal your fate in any direction. And it's really important to know that we're just talking about brain health here. So for example, This APOE gene impacts different parts of your body and your functioning as well. So actually in pregnant women, having both the E2 gene or the E4 increases your risk of certain pregnancy outcomes like preterm birth, gestational diabetes, and hypertension and all sorts of different things. So just because E2 is a lower risk for Alzheimer's doesn't mean that it's a good gene or better than E4, right? Because in pregnant women, that can increase the risk of other factors. So it's just that it makes your body work differently. And that's the best way that I think is that, to think about it, is that it just changes the way your body works. So you need to do certain things in your daily life in order to align that up and reduce your risk overall. Because under the wrong circumstances, having any sort of gene can increase your risk, and under the right circumstances, we can reduce it. So we can't change our genes, but what we do on a daily basis, we can change. And that's where we have the power, right? So we have the power to tweak our diet and our lifestyle to match our genetic makeup in order to overall reduce our risk. Every single one of us can do that. And we can do that without knowing our genes. So we can take action and put into place all of these practices that reduce, science says reduces our risk of Alzheimer's. But we can be even more specific when we know what genes you have, right? So if we know that you have an E4 gene, we know that we have to be more specific with the types of fats that you're eating. And we have to be more specific with other measures that help to clear amyloid and reduce that amyloid buildup in the first place, because your genes don't clear it that well, right? Your genes are indicating that your body doesn't clear it that well. So we need to do other things to help the body along. Whereas if you're an E2, we might not need to focus on that quite so much, but we might need to focus on something else instead. All right, so it just helps to tweak and to personalize our recommendations. It doesn't seal your fate. I can't say that enough. So it is not something to be afraid of. Whichever genes that you have them, right? And you have the power then to eat, move, and live in a particular way that suits those genes in order to reduce your risk overall. All right, so I just want to make that really, really clear, is that, if 25% of the population have APOE4 gene, if that was dooming you to Alzheimer's, then 25% of the population would have Alzheimer's, but they don't, right? We have a much, much smaller percentage of the population with Alzheimer's, and a much, much smaller percentage of those actually have the E4 gene. So it is very unique, and it is very influenced by our diet and our lifestyle and the way that we live our lives. And that is the thing that I want you to take home from this, guys, is that you have the power to match your diet and your lifestyle to your genes. That is what holds the power for you, and that is how you reduce your risk. So if you have any questions specifically about APOE, E2, E3, E4, what to do, what not to do, let me know in the comments below. Let me know if this has kind of cleared some of that up for you slightly, hopefully. But let me know if anything is still unclear or if you have any questions, and I would absolutely love to dive in and answer them for you. And I will be talking a little bit more about some other genes that are involved in Alzheimer's, and some other things to look at, to keep an eye on and to monitor next week in the next live session. All right, I hope that is helpful, guys. I can't wait to hear from you. Drop me a comment if you have any queries. Bye for now.